is Sarah Kohn. I am the Associate Curator here, and I often specialize in glass and ceramics, specifically contemporary. And I want to give you a little teaser. I didn't put this in the PowerPoint, but next month on October 10th, Coffee with the Curator will be given by Rachel Volstagg, and she's going to be talking about vanitas and still life paintings. So today you've got 3D, next month you've got some 2D, really fantastic information. For today's discussion, I wanted to show you some of the new artworks that we have, recent acquisitions, and kind of dig into them just a little bit. I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of history of studio ceramics. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but I want to show you some of our recent acquisitions. We have recently added quite a few. I don't have the number off the top of my head. We've added quite a few contemporary ceramics to our collection. And when that happens, we want to try to get these objects out for the public to see as much as possible. And so if you haven't spent some time down our contemporary craft wing in the Chan Family Contemporary Ceramics Gallery, you'll see a lot of different objects if you haven't been here since, a few months ago. We've recently changed things around. So after our talk this morning, feel free to stroll down to the gallery and spend some time looking at these objects. And I love showing things big on the screen, but nothing beats them in person. I taught for years and I always told my students that, make sure to see things in person if you can. And we're here, so feel free to meander down there after our talk. This gallery is a really interesting gallery. As I said before, it focuses on contemporary ceramics, but it includes a lot of variety when it comes to contemporary ceramics. So you'll see functional objects, you'll see fantastical objects, things that are kind of somewhere in between. You wouldn't necessarily use them, but they have kind of a functional shape. So we're gonna talk a little bit about how contemporary ceramics blurs the boundaries between fine art and what we would consider kind of utilitarian or functional art. Before we get into our contemporary objects though, I just want to set the stage really quickly to talk about what was kind of going on, and this was for generations before the studio ceramic movement in the early 20th century. So before that, before the artists that we're going to look at start kind of questioning things, most ceramics were made in large factories that were employed by skilled craft people to create kind of utilitarian or decorative objects. So their focus was things like vases, bowls, cups, dinnerware, that type of thing. You didn't see a huge amount of sculpture for sculpture's sake. If you did, it was really kind of meant to decorate the home, a little different than what some of the artists today we're going to look at are really thinking about. So these factories are spread across the world. There were a lot of them in Europe, but I wanted to show you a photograph of one much closer to home. So this is the Roseville Pottery Factory, and it's in Roseville, Ohio. And for those of you who are familiar with ceramics, you might know that there's a huge kind of portion of Ohio where it was really active in ceramic production. And so the hanging planter that we have in our collection is from Roseville pottery. So this was really kind of the go-to for ceramics before we start to see artists kind of questioning the form and the way things are made. So kind of removing themselves from the factory. That's a big aspect of the studio craft movement in general, but the studio ceramic movement. So then we get into the beginnings of the movement, and here we have two of our, I guess you could say, kind of leaders in the studio ceramic movement, and we are blessed to have recently obtained two artworks, one from each of these artists. So I'll get into Bernard Leitch and Shoji Hamada in just a moment, but before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what these artists are thinking about, why we start to see the change. A lot of the artists in the early 20th century were involved in schools of thought like the Bauhaus or the arts and crafts movement, where you're starting to think about artwork outside of a factory type setting and exploring production on a much smaller scale. So very intimate studio settings, why we call it studio ceramics. So we have the birth of what we call the call it studio pottery, studio clay. You'll notice today I will use the word ceramics as opposed to pottery. They're interchangeable, but it's just kind of how I think of them. So I'll use the term ceramics throughout the lecture. So we have the definition of the studio ceramics movement really kind of details or is focused on a smaller, more intimate setting. So it's basically artists who are either working alone or who are working in small groups, producing unique items in smaller quantities. So it's almost the antithesis of a factory setting. Typically, the artist is involved in all stages of the manufacture, so they're the ones doing everything from modeling the clay to applying the glaze to then doing any of the detail work. In a traditional factory setting, you would have multiple people doing those individual jobs. So we're kind of bringing it into this much smaller setting. During the early years of the movement, we see a large emphasis coming out of England and Great Britain. So Bernard Leitch, of course, is one of our founders of the studio ceramics movement, and he was an English potter or ceramicist. But a lot of them that we have in the gallery that are kind of our forerunners of ceramics, Bernard Leitch, Lucy Ree, and Hans Kopper all lived in England. And we'll see works by them in just a moment. First, let's get into these two figures. So Bernard Leitch and Shoji Hamada. So Leitch was not only an artist, but he was also a teacher. And that's something that's really important to know in pretty much all of the ceramics set of the contemporary world. We have a lot of teachers. And that's not just contemporary, but in our case, you're gonna see connections. This person studied with this person, who studied with this person. And sometimes you can see a stylistic thread that runs through all of their work. Sometimes students go the exact opposite of their teachers. But the studio movement, because it's so kind of an intimate space, you are learning from each other on a much smaller scale. And so we have the teacher-student relationship is quite important. So Bernard Leitch is one of those early studio ceramic artists who went on to be a teacher. He was really fascinated with Japanese ceramics. Specifically, he liked the technique of raku. So he traveled to Japan in 1909 to study that technique. And the technique itself is quite old. It dates back to the 16th century. And the process is basically you have an object in the kiln, it's at its highest temperature, and you remove it from the kiln. And there are a number of things you can do after that. Some Japanese artists would place it in cold water, some would just leave it out, and it changes the surface of the clay, and it creates some really beautiful textured and surface effects. So he was fascinated with that. He also really was enamored with the simplicity of Japanese ceramics. Tea bowls especially were created with the raku technique. And so he went over to Japan to kind of glean information from these artists who've been working for generations in these styles. So he kind of saw himself as a courier between the East and the West. He was really enamored with how they kind of thought about artwork in a different way, but he also wanted to apply some of his Western techniques to these ancient Japanese techniques. So he ends up spending time in Japan, and he meets Shoji Hamada, who you see over here on the right side of the screen. And they become fast friends, and they work together for years. Hamada actually moves to England to teach with Leitch. They teach at a pottery studio in St. Ives in Cornwall. So from his practices, he creates this kind of new aesthetic, and it's sometimes called the Leitch aesthetic, after his last name, or the brown pot aesthetic. And basically, artists who are adopting this aesthetic, they are really advocating for simplicity. And if you look at the two objects here, especially comparing the objects as we go on in the lecture, you'll see the focus on simplicity, the focus on the beautiful lines of the vase, the symmetry. They're really thinking about the form. We tend to see very modest decoration with the Leitch or the brown pot method or aesthetic, and oftentimes they are utilitarian. So we have two vases here. And so you can actually use them, whether or not people do use them, they wanted them to be utilitarian. They wanted them to have the option to be used. So he liked to work in small teams, a lot of students, so he kind of, again, creates this generational push toward contemporary ceramics, and he leaves a lasting impression on many, many people. Fast forward into the 1940s, he's kind of got this aesthetic down, and he is well known throughout Europe, and he starts to think about how he can really get the message out. So in 1940, he publishes a book that's called The Potter's Book, and it includes philosophical ideals, practical information, and again, serves as more inspiration for those who can't necessarily study with him. They read his book and then they kind of adopt some of these practices. He also traveled to the United States to lecture and demo, again, spreading information. That's a key factor in all of this. Shoji Hamada was a Japanese ceramic artist, often referred to as a folk artist, a Japanese folk artist. He's considered one of the masters of modern clay, though, because he questioned the idea of the hierarchy between craft and fine art. So this idea between something that's used, you use it every day, you don't necessarily think about it, it exists to be functional, versus something that exists to be an object of art. Can those two things merge? Do they have to be separate? So many of these artists are thinking along those lines. Hamada followed the Zen Buddhist lifestyle, and he emphasized in his artwork and in his life simplicity and minimalism. He championed the beauty of the handmade, and when you look at his artwork, you see very subtle decorations. So this one, we have a beautiful, it's a little discolored on the screen, but when you go down to the gallery, you'll see it's a beautiful brown glaze. And then there are just a handful of brush strokes that create this organic form right in the center. So he didn't want to overly decorate things. He wanted it to be very minimal. And so you're focusing a little less on what you see in the brush strokes, and you're focusing more on the balance of the pot and the texture and how beautifully formed this structure is. So this is just like a little fun fact, in the kind of folk tradition, very rarely did Hamada sign any of his artwork. And that's a little unique, and as we get further on, you'll see artists sign their work a lot. So these two are recent acquisitions, as is everything today, and they really are fundamental in the story of studio ceramics. So I'm really glad that we have them on view. Now, moving on to other artists who are really fundamental in the beginnings of this movement, we have Lucy Reed. She is, of course, an influencer of multiple generations of artists. She worked with Bernard Leitch for a while, and she spent a number of years participating in a partnership with Hans Kopper, who we'll look at in just a moment. So again, that relationship we see forming. She taught in London at the Camberwell School of Arts, and so again, teaching further generations. Excuse me, she's known for this really kind of beautiful, simplistic form. Again, focusing on objects that are functional, but really focusing on the form, the shape of the object, oftentimes very minimalistic decorations. Before she got into her mature style, which is what you see here, a footed bowl is very traditionally a Lucy Reed style. It's made on the wheel, so the bottom half is made, the top half is made, and then they're joined together. So she is known for this very simple footed bowl aesthetic and technique. But before that, she actually was relatively successful in operating an accessory business. She operated it during World War II in London. So she would make buckles and buttons for high-end fashion. And that design aesthetic kind of transferred into her design aesthetic for ceramics. She was always very interested in clay, but she, the timing wasn't right. And then she ended up getting into this style. And in the 1950s, she started making tableware. Within 10 years, her artwork could be found in many department stores. Then she moves kind of further beyond the department store tableware into what you see here. So her objects kind of push us further into the realm of fine art. They're very simply decorated. She often uses this raw glazing technique where she applies glaze directly to the surface of an unfired object. And so since the object is fired and glazed at the same time, it's a little quicker. It began as, again, she had to produce very quickly. It was a practical choice. She didn't have easy access to a kiln, but that technique of glazing and firing at the same time became synonymous with her aesthetic and her style, so she continued to do that. And so you often see kind of a matte surface with little runners. In this particular case, they're very fine line decorations. Sometimes you'll just see a couple different glazes. It's very minimal. Really, she's wanting you to focus on the shape of the form itself. The stars in the corners of these slides indicate objects that are currently on view. Almost all of them are, but I wanted to throw in a couple of really important artists that we don't have on view yet, but we will, likely soon. So next we have Hans Kopper, another British ceramicist. He saw himself primarily as a sculptor. So even though his forms often seem functional, this again technically is a functional object. It is not intended to be, he never intended it to be functional. He was very much inspired by art, and in particular, the sculpture that you see at the top of the slide. So he was really fascinated by ancient sculptures. This is a Cycladic figure. So it is the Cycladic islands of Greece. They really focused on figures of women predominantly. There are some men, but the women, we find there's hundreds of these little figures. And they all have a very similar style, very stylized and geometric. And so you can kind of see, even with these two images, the correlation. So he saw himself first as a sculptor. He was inspired by these ancient structures or ancient sculptures, the Cycladic figures in particular. And he restricted himself to a very small amount of glazes. He used kind of a white, a brown, and a black, and he used those colors throughout his entire career. His objects are pretty recognizable when you're looking through, if you were to wander through a museum, you can more than likely pinpoint a Kopper. He worked alongside Basara, as I mentioned, for quite a while, and they, of course, shared ideas, and you can see a little bit of the stylization of both of them. You can see how they're influencing each other. So he really emphasized the form itself, just like the others. Now this one has a little bit more texture, and he created this texture to kind of enhance the shape, but also as a nod back to those ancient objects. They kind of almost defy gravity too. His and Lucy Rees, they sit on these very small pedestals. You're always a little concerned, but they have this beautiful balance because it's all about the form at this point. So we're starting to see a shift though. So we have a generation of artists who are thinking about art in a different way, ceramics in a different way, but they're still creating functional objects. And then we start to see another generation of artists, or another group of artists, who are pushing the boundaries even further. So a lot of artists will follow in the footsteps of Leitch, Hamada, Reed, and Kopper, but some of them are going to push the boundaries. So boundary pushing is part of contemporary art, of course, and we really like to see some pushing of boundaries with ceramics like this. This is Peter Volkes. So a lot of these artists who are going beyond function, kind of addressing form, they're thinking about the object outside of the functional world. Some of them are influenced by other art movements of the time, so abstract expressionism. Volkes in particular was connected to some of the abstract expressionist painters. Think of like Jackson Pollock or Helen Frankenthaler, people who are gesturing on their canvases. And I always think of that inspiration on the clay. And if you look at this, this is a wall, it's a wall piece. And he has almost slash marks in the clay. It's very gestural, very abstract. You can kind of feel his movements in this piece. So he's taking the idea of ceramics outside of that function to create something that's purely sculptural. And he's very influenced by the other art of the time. So he actually studied painting before he was working with clay. He taught at Otis Art Institute in LA, and then later at the University of California in Berkeley. So again, Voulkos, like the others, becomes a teacher to the next generation, and you'll see that thread throughout. So he encouraged his students to handle clay, in a very loose, expressionistic manner. And you can see that both in the piece that we have and maybe in the black and white photograph. There is not that very refined surface. There's chunks of clay pasted all over. So he was inspired, as I said, by the abstract expressionists. He was also really inspired by his teacher, Bernard Leitch and Shoji Hamada, and their concept of Zen wholeness and unity. So they loved unity in form in a very balanced way, very simple lines, clean lines. He kind of interpreted it in a very different way, where the Zen is part of the experience of making the clay object. You can kind of see his movements within the clay. So he experimented with things like wheel-thrown vessels, objects, assembled forms. He loved to just kind of put clay together and mold it around. So the texture is very rough. There's almost like an aggressiveness to how these pieces are kind of ripped and torn and cut apart. But it was all about that experience. He also really was interested in wood burning kilns because they are notoriously unpredictable. And so he liked that unpredictability. Again, it kind of goes along with the ideas of chance. And so he's going to usher in a different aspect of contemporary ceramics, where it's not as highly refined, it's about something different. It's about the experience and the gesture. He goes on, artists like Richard Devore are also playing around with that idea. So Devore actually is much, much closer to home. He attended Cranbrook Academy of Art in 1957. And shortly after that, he began a body of work, which is what he's known for. He kind of practiced it throughout his career, which is what you see in these two vessels. He then later on became the head of the ceramics department at Cranbrook. So in 1966, he led that department and again taught a future generation of artists. He liked the vessel form, but he took it a step beyond. Again, pushing boundaries. So when you look at both of these, instantly you can say, oh, well, they look like vases or they look like large bowls. But when you look really closely and when they're on view, you can really see these details. There is something about them that takes them out of the realm of functionality. So there's a beautiful kind of modeled surface. You can see almost the handprints in the surface. There's oftentimes a fold or a cut in the vase or the vessel. In the image on the left, you can see the fold down the side. Or there'll be some sort of dip and ridge in the bottom. So he kind of plays around with that traditional form, but pulls it into the realm of something that's non-functional and something in the realm that we would kind of consider fine art. So again, exploring this boundary between traditional craft and fine art. Let me make sure I'm not keeping anything out of here. We kind of look at these and think that maybe they're relatively simple vessels that he pinches and folds and really can create quite quickly. But that's not the case. This actually, each one of these vessels had a very long time of processing in his design phase. He thought about the shapes of them for a long time. So while they seem like they could be quickly constructed, they're not. He's contemplating these shapes over and over again and contemplating the designs. Paul Solner was one of the first students of Peter Voulkos. So if you look at this large vessel, you can kind of see those cracks down towards the bottom, and you see a little bit more of a rough surface. It's a little reminiscent of that large wall platter that has the chunks and the slashes. And so here's a direct connection where we see teacher and student interacting. Now, Solner ended up teaching at Scripps College in Claremont, California, again, pushing the style along, and he's credited with creating what we call American raku, which is very similar to the Japanese technique, but the object is removed from the kiln when it's kind of bright red and hot, and it's subjected to post-firing reduction. Oftentimes, it's placed in containers with combustible materials, so leaves or something like that. So it's a little different than the Japanese technique because he's been adding something to it, a combustible material, which then changes the glaze and it creates some of these like dark spots and lines. And so they're taking a traditional technique and kind of pushing the boundaries a little further. Typical, vase structure, but pushing it beyond. Now we're getting into artists who are not really even thinking about traditional forms at all. And we're going to look at, really briefly, the California funk movement. So while some ceramic artists use the new freedom of function to kind of play around with techniques, play around with ways we make clay, ways we make objects, there is a whole group of artists who venture into figuration, or they venture into overtly narrative subject matters. So you've got people like Devore, who are pushing the boundaries of form into something that kind of still resembles a functional object, a platter or a vase. And then we see artists like Robert Arneson, who are just taking it right out of the realm of any sort of function. And we see this really heavily in California. So a couple of these next artists are associated with the funk art movement. So the funk art movement in the 60s and 70s was really brought on in part by the pop art movement. So if you're familiar with artwork like Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, where they're taking very popular subjects and interpreting them for a contemporary world, sometimes poking fun or making a social critique. So funk art kind of is born out of that. And Robert Arneson is a perfect example of an artist who is pushing those boundaries and who is really incorporating narrative into his work. So it's typically synonymous with ceramics of the California Bay region. Arneson himself was a student of Peter Voulkos, and he went, of course, the opposite direction, and his work is, I guess you could say quirky is the best way to describe it, I think. He loved self-portraits. He liked to kind of create things that were potentially just humorous, but also sometimes with a social critique. This one is called Local Mind Disaster, like local mind, but local mind disaster. And if you think about a disaster in mind, it often creates an explosion, or it's created by an explosion. He actually put explosives inside this self-portrait and lit them, and when they exploded, that's what you see. So he took the time to create this really lifelike self-portrait, and then starts to play around. So it's not just that portrait. Sorry about that. So he was the first one kind of connected to this California funk movement. He loved oddball humor, socially provocative imagery, and really just playing around with different themes. This artist played around with one theme for most of his entire career. So this is David Gilchrist. The object on the left is actually it's not in the contemporary ceramics area, it's down our decorative arts hallway, it's in the animal show, so I highly recommend walking through that too. But David Gilchrist is also a member of the ceramics funk movement. Like everyone else, he's playing around with different techniques, and in 1965, he found his subject. He started to create frogs. And from 1965 through the rest of his career, his subject matter was almost exclusively frogs. And he talks a little bit about it, and he just said that he wanted to create them, and he created a frog world. So we have a basket of frogs, we have a mummy with a frog face. Other objects of his, you'll see a frog that is sandwiched in between bread to look like a sandwich or a hamburger or something like that. They're all a little quirky. They all incorporate this one particular subject, and sometimes they include found objects like the wicker basket that you see. So playing around with what clay can do, that's one of the things Gilchrist was really focused on. Now he loved, his figures are very kind of roughly modeled, but that's becomes his signature device. So if you ever are looking through, again, a ceramics collection, you'll know Gilchrist when you see it. Viola Fry, you can't miss this when you walk down the hallway. So Viola Fry is another member of the California ceramics movement. She's closer related to Arneson. I don't know if I would call her necessarily part of the funk movement, but she's kind of on the periphery of that. And she is most known for her larger than life figures. So she worked alongside Robert Arneson for quite a while, and she liked to explore scale. But she also had a very particular subject matter. So her large objects are almost exclusively figures, but she would also create smaller objects, and she would even draw and paint, like you see on the right, that would have kind of everyday objects that you would find at the flea market. She loved to shop secondhand and find little trinkets. So she incorporated these trinkets into her larger objects. The men in the suits are a very typical subject matter for her. They allude to masculinity, they allude to kind of the proper 1950s household. The women that she creates often have dresses with, very traditional dresses with hats and all of the details that kind of traditional feminine imagery. So they're big. They're very big. And she started off relatively small and got bigger and bigger and bigger. And she started making life-size objects. But she was in her studio one day, and one of them started to bubble. And she realized there was a limit to how far she could get with one figure and its height. So about life size, and that was really a struggle, but she wanted to go bigger. So what she did is she devised this plan of creating a modular image, or modular artwork. So for Arrogant Man, you can see the pieces. It's fit together like a puzzle. So she would build the individual pieces. Again, when you look at these, just a very quick glance, there's a lot of rough surface, a lot of texture. The paint is very gestural. One could make the conclusion that it's very quickly made. It's not the case at all. She spent so much time planning because she had to have each section fit together perfectly, or almost perfectly, and then they bolt together. So it's essentially a puzzle. Because she had to be so precise with the puzzle of the figures, she couldn't really be as gestural and as expressive in the clay itself. What she did then, to kind of create that gesture and that expression, is she used really vibrant glazes. So that's where she could really play around. She loved to play around with color. Unlike a lot of artists at the time, she used store-bought glazes. She didn't make her own. And she loved to just paint these really beautiful swaths of color. So all of that, when you see it in person, you'll see how you can almost feel the brushwork, very much like Peter Voulkos playing with the clay. And the photograph here, you can get a sense of scale. So that's Viola right there, and those are some of her other figures. Okay, I want to quickly talk about some techniques, some artists who are playing around with technique. So they're exploring form, but also exploring techniques. So we'll kind of move through these relatively quickly. So this is Basara, and he was really inspired by Japanese Amari style decoration. So this was a style of decoration that was really popular in the 17th and 18th century. You can see the bowl at the top of the slide. They often used red, gold, like a royal blue, and sometimes kind of green and pink. The red, the blue, and the white are very iconic of the Amari style. And he loved the artwork of M.C. Escher. So if you look at Untitled here on the left, you can kind of see those influences in that piece, especially with the color here, and then the design. I just instantly see the design there, just very much a connection. So his influences are very prevalent. Sorry about that, my desk is small. So he, unlike many artists who incorporate a narrative, he really talked about form. So this is a quote from Basara. He said, "My work is not postmodern in the sense that I'm not only making a statement of social, political, conceptual, or even an intellectual art. There is no meaning or metaphor. I am committed more to the idea of pure beauty. When it's finished, the piece should look like an ornament, exquisitely beautiful." And he creates that with these glazes. Now this one is gold. There's so much gold on the surface. So he would basically add a color, and then you had to fire that. You'd add another color and fire that. So he's got layers and layers and layers of glaze. And it's a highly complicated technique, and it's very prone to failure. So he mastered this technique of the overlaying of the glazes. And he had to know exactly what glaze he was going to use in sequence, because you can't put one over the other and get the desired effect. So he was very intentional with all of his techniques. Artists like Katsumata are also playing around with technique. In 1973, she began designing tableware in Paris. And she quickly grew tired of tableware and decided to create these undulating forms. So they almost look like sea creatures. And this is her preferred form. And the yellow that you see on the outside has a really incredible texture, especially compared to the texture underneath. So there are two very distinct textures. The top one is kind of matte, almost like a matted surface. And she would achieve this in part by placing like a cheesecloth or some very porous cloth on top of the sculpture, and then stipple the glaze through that. And so you don't end up seeing any brush strokes or anything like that. And she plays around with glaze constantly, but it always has a very organic effect. Teresa Bron is another artist who's thinking about nature and thinking about different techniques. The photograph at the top, I'm sure it's very hard to see, but it's a really good example of what she does. So she uses paper-thin sheets of porcelain and then wraps them around found objects. She has a large collection in her studio of seeds, nuts, twigs, anything that's out in the world that she is fascinated by. She'll collect them and keep them in her studio for when the time is right. So the plants that are used in this are likely, the technical name escapes me, but it's a hogsweed plant. And she would wrap the flowers of that in very, very thin porcelain. And when it's fired, the organic matter, of course, burns away. And then you're left with these incredibly delicate little pieces of clay that almost look like coral. Irenaezeva is known for her painting. So we're kind of exploring different techniques of how to decorate here. And her vessels, of course, they're handmade. She does not throw them on a wheel, they're pinched, and she creates all of these really fantastical forms. And her forms are technically functional, but they're very beyond the realm of function. You'd never use this as a pitcher or a teapot. There's very delicate coral-like clay at the top and the stopper. All of that's created by hand. And then she goes in and paints these fantastical, whimsical scenes. So the technique she's using here is porcelain painting or china painting, which is an overglazed technique. So the image or the object is glazed, and then she goes in and paints all of these fine details over everything, over the surface of the object. It's a really, again, a very time-consuming process, very much like Ralph Basara's. The enamels, the glazes she uses are made of metal oxides. They're mixed with glass, and they flux at different temperatures, and it's very much scientific as well as fine art, concept. These two artists are going really back to their very traditional origins. And we have two artists, Bonnie and Melda, from the Nampeo family. Now the Nampeo family, their artwork is deeply rooted in tradition. They're descendants of the Nampeo of Hanno, who was a prolific Hopi artist. And what she did is she just taught subsequent generations. These, I think, are fourth generation Hopi painters and are potters, and they are bringing the tradition, kind of keeping it in the family. Now, Bonnie on the left, that wave style that you see, the kind of large black waves, they almost look like claws, that is very, very typical of the Nampeo family. But she modernizes it, whereas a traditional wave form would have straight lines here, very beautifully straight lines throughout each one of those waves. She kind of modernizes it within the realm of tradition, and she instead paints the whole surface black and then scrapes away, and you see those little loops. Those are all scraped away, so then you see the terracotta underneath. So they're reaching into their traditional imagery, but modernizing it, to kind of make it personal. And then we're gonna end with teapots, just really quickly, because they're so fun, and it's Coffee with a Curator, so we've got a hot drink connection. Just really quickly, it's a fitting way to finish. So tea, of course, is one of the most consumed beverages in the world. The only other beverage that's consumed more than tea is water, and it's a really fascinating form for a lot of ceramic artists. It employs pretty much every type of technique that you utilize, so wheel thrown, hand building. It takes a lot to create a teapot that functions properly too. You have to be aware of the placement of everything and how it will manipulate or change once it's fired. And so it's almost a rite of passage. And it's not surprising that you see contemporary artists embracing this form. I mean, it's a traditional form, and it's, goes thousands of years back. It's very, very traditional, but also it leaves so much opportunity for expression. Richard Notkin here was really inspired by Chinese Yixing pots, which you see at the top. And he's actually very, very inspired by that shape of our pot at the top, right-hand side. So it is inspired by, it's called a Buddha's hand teapot, and it's based on citron fruit. So the fruit here, it's a citron fruit, and it ends up looking like fingers. So he was really fascinated with the Yixing pots, but also that particular one. And he incorporates hearts. That's a fan or a favorite of his. Here we have a heart that's machine made. You can see the rivets and the little pieces of metal, and it's all wrapped up in a chain. He doesn't often tell us exactly what to think, but I think it's a really interesting subject matter here. So an artist playing around with a very typical form in a very contemporary way. And the last two we're going to look at are Claudia Tarantino and Ceritrella. So they are, again, using that traditional form, but pushing into the realm of organic inspiration. So Claudia Tarantino grew up in a large Italian-American family, and she talked about how food was always an inspiration. There was food always on the table. They had large family dinners, and so when she started to make art, she incorporated her life into her art. And a lot of her pottery or her ceramics is basically a representation of food. So you have a large amount of figs in this. The spout is right here. This is where you would add the water, and then here. Now, technically they're functional. I highly doubt anyone would actually use these to make tea, but again, we've seen this tradition throughout the day. And Ceritrella is fascinated with wood. So all of his teapots look grown from, in a forest. Birch is one of his favorite woods to replicate. And if you go down and you see this in person, it very much looks like it is made of wood. So he's spent his entire career with this creation, and his goal is to show the fragility and the beauty of nature, but he also wants to bring awareness to our impact on nature. So he's kind of playing with this idea of environmentalism. So these are just a sample. We have many more contemporary artworks on display that I didn't get into because we're already at 45 minutes. So I hope that you have a wonderful journey down to the gallery. Does anybody have any questions? All right, well, there's more coffee and snacks. Thank you.